on the
Mike.
All right, well,
No,
we're
it's good.
pleased
Thanks.
to have Professor Maria Talero as the first speaker for our fall semester speaker series. I know Maria Talero from Penn State, where we were both graduate students together. Since that time, she has been teaching at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, and we are extremely pleased to have her here as our new colleague in the philosophy department. This paper she's presenting today is a version of a presentation she gave last month in England. And so without further ado, Professor Maria Talero.
Okay, so the title of my talk, The Contraction and Expansion of Interpersonal States. The 20th century movement, known as phenomenology, began as a call to return to the things themselves, or in other words, to engage with renewed vigor in a close examination of the real phenomena of human experience, as these are actually lived by us, and not as they are reconstructed in philosophical abstraction. So the work of Merleau-Ponty, as one of the central figures in this movement, was striking in that it viewed the empirical sciences, especially the developmental and brain sciences of his day, as in a certain way able to help or to aid in the phenomenological project. So now fast forward to today, and there's a new call for action that's being made, and it goes by the name of naturalizing phenomenology. And the idea behind this is that the work of phenomenology can be carried out not only by drawing upon the results of the empirical sciences, but by becoming the science itself. So consciousness, it is alleged, can in principle be scientifically reconstructed in all its fullness. And it may soon be possible, or so the story goes, to be both phenomenologists and scientists without contradiction. So in this paper, I offer a muted challenge to this emerging paradigm. I will do so by drawing on the work of Merleau-Ponty to outline what I will call an inactive or a situated approach to human experience or human cognition. And I hope to show why such an approach cannot be replaced by empirical inquiry and scientific method. So in the talk, I'll be speaking of Merleau-Ponty as holding what I'm going to call an inactive or a situated view of human experience, and I'll frequently refer to his thesis as the inactive thesis. So I'll be working basically in broad strokes from within Merleau-Ponty's position to identify some experiential phenomena that resist investigation through the methods of the empirical sciences. So in particular, I'm going to focus on our experience of the relationship between the perceptual and the interpersonal domains of human experience. What I want to show is twofold. One, I want to show that Merleau-Ponty's inactive thesis entails that perception is permeable to the contextualizing influences of our relations with other people, and consequently, point two, I want to show that this places special limitations on the accessibility of phenomenological forms to empirical observation and quantification. Okay, so the central premise of Merleau-Ponty's inactive approach to consciousness is the claim that the embodied experiencer is behaviorally coupled with the affordances of the environment. So let me explain this point in a second. So that the way things look to me and my bodily behavior mutually constrain and condition one another. So I experience my environment as harboring behavioral possibilities for action. And conversely, the bodily activities in which I engage at a practical pre-reflective level constrain the terms in which things can appear to me. So I'm going to expand that point a little bit. So what this means is that I basically experience, I'll leave it up. I experience my environment as harboring behavioral possibilities for action. Or in other words, my body and the world are hermeneutically wedded to one another. The very phenomenal appearance of things for me harbors experiential cues to engage in familiar behavioral repertoires. Conversely, my behavioral repertoires selectively allow certain phenomena to appear as salient and leave others in the background. And this is what Merleau-Ponty means by his central concept, being in the world. It's what he means by calling the mode of human existence one of being in the world. Okay, so a little bit more on that point. So what this entails is that anything that we could point to as the what of experience, or its basic content, is never actually basic or simple in form, but is always fundamentally relational or mediated in nature. So in other words, every what of experience is always embedded in a how. Conversely, this means that there is nothing that we are able to experience that would not appear differently, provided the form of activity that conditions its appearance were to change. Okay, so what I want to do now is to use this Merleau-Pontian enactive approach to reveal some of the limitations of empirical method when it comes to capturing the phenomenological structures of experience. So I will do this by arguing that interpersonal relationships with other people inactively mediate perceptual experience by affecting the very look of things for us at a perceptual level. In other words, perception is not a strictly pre-personal phenomenon, but rather it's necessarily permeable, or we could say it's vulnerable to cultural and social influences, which means it is enacted differently in different cultural and social settings. And if this is the case, then this limits what we can expect to accomplish with empirical data. So to carry this out, I want to introduce the concept of what I'm going to be calling an experiential workspace. This is my own term, but it carries forward and modifies Heidegger's notion, for those of you who studied Heidegger, of the equipmental context, or the experiential setting in which we find ourselves situated when we engage in a task or a project. So I'm going to be using this concept as a tool throughout the rest of my paper to draw out some specific phenomenological characteristics that on Merleau-Ponty's understanding pertain to all experience by virtue of its enacted character, that also problematize the distinction between the ostensibly pre-personal domain of perception and the first personal sphere of social relations, and that finally are the ones that function so as to resist empirical verification. So, an experiential workspace, as I am using the term, is the behavioral setting that is generated by my engagement in my projects and tasks, whether these be found in the domain of perception, cognition, or interpersonal relationships. Experiential workspaces, in other words, are the local contexts in which we have our being in the world, or you could say the local couplings enacted between any particular behavioral repertoire and the affordances, to use J.J. Gibson's term, or the experiential pathways of that environment in which that repertoire is deployed. So in Merleau-Ponty's understanding, we are always already behaviorally embedded in one, and probably more than one, experiential workspace. That is to say, it is always the case that we are experientially absorbed by our tasks within a certain practical setting, insofar as we are always unthematically involved with some aspects of our surroundings, while being simultaneously engaged with other aspects which function as the thematic or explicit theme of our awareness. So, what I propose then is that we investigate the phenomenological character of the experiential workspace, or the enactively generated behavioral setting, through our familiarity with what we would more generically call everyday work, in order to deepen our understanding of Merleau-Ponty's enacted thesis. So, please think about what it's like to be at work on something. One of the most characteristic things of being at work on any complex or absorbing task is that there are certain features of the experience that are encountered only when we're actually engaged in working on it. So my work project has experiential parameters that are apparent to me to the extent that I am meaningfully engaged in that project. When I set it aside, these parameters become inaccessible. These affordances, or experiential pathways by which the work presents itself as able to be taken up, improved, or modified, are enacted precisely in and through the behavioral orientation adopted by someone who is closely engaged in coping with its demands. This is why, when I have a project underway, it's not always possible for someone else to step in and smoothly take over that project, even if they're already familiar with the materials or equipment I'm working with. So it's like they have to go through a process of gearing in to the work. Similarly, when you interrupt your own work, its real demands become harder to discern. As, so for example, when you've been on vacation too long and the notes for an article or a paper you were working on now seem opaque and puzzling to you upon your return. We can summarize these observations by saying the work in progress enacts its own norms, which are available only to the extent that one is behaviorally attuned to them. Okay, so let's take that insight back to Merleau-Ponty's enactive model. And what we see is that on his view, every experience, since it is a form of being in the world, exhibits this same trait of being accessible only to the extent that one is already engaged in a particular experiential workspace at issue. This is what it means for the active body to be behaviorally coupled with its environment. It means that I am continually embedded in a dynamic experiential setting with its own emergent norms that become apparent only as I enact the skillful activities that pertain to that setting. So, my argument is that this includes the perceptual domain. As is well known, Merleau-Ponty defends a thoroughgoing enacted position with respect to the most basic of perceptual phenomena. So this is not just my position, this is his position. This is a project that is also persuasively being carried out today in the work of contemporary philosophers Alva Noe and Kevin O'Regan, among others. So the point is that with regard to perception, on this kind of account, this kind of enactive account, such as Merleau-Ponty's or O'Regan and Noe's, we could say that perception is a form of work in the precise sense in which I have characterized it above. But this has an important implication for the way we understand the relationship between perception and interpersonal experience, the sphere of our relationships with other people. It entails that perception is itself an embedded phenomenon, that it's never a neutral function operating independently of cultural and social influences. Or, to put this another way, the skillful activity of perceptual life is embedded within the experiential workspace of our relationships with others. Okay, so using the phenomenology of the experiential workspace that we outlined above, let's look at some examples of how this is so. So my first example comes from the work of Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, and that's work on childhood learning. So first let me tell you about it. Vygotsky argued that there is a developmental window of opportunity that appears when a child interacts with someone else who is more advanced than she is, whether that person is a peer or an adult. So by sharing attentional space with another person, in other words, the child is able to function beyond her means, so to speak, or at a higher developmental level than she had herself on her own previously attained. Vygotsky called the space of joint attention that summons new behavioral resources out of the child the zone of proximal development. So let me give you a definition. The zone of proximal development is the enhanced behavioral possibilities that become available when a child interacts with a more developmentally advanced collaborator in a shared task. So just to cite a simple example from a 1987 study by House and Farber, they found that toddlers who play with 5-year-olds exhibited more complex forms of social play than those who only played with their own age peers, right, other toddlers. But I think we see this same kind of phenomenon all over the place. Right? You see it anywhere that children enter into apprentice-like relationships with others, whether those others are adults or other children. Right? So for example, when a child who had lagged behind in learning how to ride a bike suddenly makes a developmental leap forward when a troop of older cousins come for a visit and they all know how to ride. And so what I would like to argue is that in such contexts, it is the very perceptual look of the situation that is altered for the child by her cooperation with another person. In other words, she experiences the task at hand as harboring more experiential pathways in the collaborative situation than it does when she is on her own. The evidence for this is in her greater confidence and skill in carrying it out. So the workspace in which she is at work is thus precisely the task-structured space of shared attention between herself and a more capable peer or adult. In that space, the very phenomenal character of her environment is altered. The previously frustrating task suddenly becomes a conduit to satisfactory involvement. It's now as if the situation has more experiential handholds, and she's literally better able to get a grip on it. Okay, so now I want to show an example of how the converse is also possible. Okay, so if Vygotsky's concept illustrates the way that the scope of our behavioral repertoires can be expanded or enhanced by our relations with others, we also know of other contexts in which the workspace in which we are engaged is experienced as inhibited or constricted in scope, once again precisely through the medium of our relations with others. The late feminist philosopher Iris Young discusses this phenomenon in her influential essay, Throwing Like a Girl, where she examines the behavioral space of young girls who are raised in a cultural milieu that discourages their involvement in physical activity. She says, the timidity, immobility, and uncertainty that frequently characterize feminine movement project a limited space for the feminine I can. In other words, for young women who grow up in precisely the kind of cultural milieu that Young has in mind, namely one that provides them very little opportunity to become confident in sports, the workspace of playing ball is experienced negatively as harboring zones of possible involvement that are available for others, but not for me. These are experiential pathways that manifest themselves precisely at the perceptual level. The field looks too wide for me to cross it. The ball seems to be moving too fast for me to catch it. So the very look of things says, someone else could do that, namely a boy, but I cannot. Okay, so now I want to extract what I see as the implications of my argument concerning experiential workspaces. So first of all, workspaces are only accessible to the extent that we are engaged in the corresponding forms of meaningful activity or have already acquired the corresponding behavioral repertoires. 2, and yet, even though they are dependent on the activation of already acquired behavioral repertoires, workspaces are labile, complex, epistemically open phenomena. Right? This is what we see in Vygotsky's notion of the zone of proximal development. Right? That the very way that things look to me is open to being usurped and transformed by sharing attentional workspace with somebody else. 3. This epistemic openness to recontextualization means that experiential workspaces are therefore not easily accessible for verification, precisely because they're in their very character an active, emergent phenomenon. before, this means that when we try to study them in the behavioral setting enacted by the social or empirical sciences, we recontextualize them and transform their constituent phenomena. So those are my conclusions. Let's go back up to the second point. If the enacted thesis is that the norms that govern our experiential workspaces do not determinately pre-exist them, right? But are given only in and through the activity by which we engage in them, then it follows that when we try to gear in to an experiential workspace for the sake of subjecting it to empirical verification, we transgress on its epistemically open labile edge. And so the second point is the point that's most immediately problematic for the accessibility of phenomenological structures to empirical study and inquiry. Okay, so just move forward here. Okay, so just a few words then in conclusion. So I think that the question then becomes, is the way that we gear in phenomenologically precise and articulate enough to capture the intrinsic character of the workspace that we were interested in the first place? Or does it rather usurp and transform that workspace in accordance with the implicit behavioral norms of the material and empirical sciences, and subtly altering the work being enacted and changing the phenomena that appear as a consequence? So I'll end merely with the suggestion that I think that there is room for concern here, and that if the phenomenological enacted thesis is right, experiential workspaces are quite vulnerable to recontextualization, more so than we may realize. And this is because the very look of things in them is given differently to the extent that the behavior that sustains their way of appearing shifts or is subtly altered. So this makes them, in a sense, more radically individualized and unique than we may suspect. To end with an analogy inspired by Vygotsky, the living phenomenological texture of our experiential workspaces may be like the private social play that takes place between children, inherently difficult to approach with empirical tools, insofar as when we put children in contexts where such tools could be applied, the mercurial, spontaneous character of their private play is transformed and taken up into a different social setting, one in which the phenomena we were interested in may not exhibit themselves any longer in precisely the same way.
Well, we have time for questions and answers.
I'm struck by the whole discussion of the experiential workspace by a debate, and I don't know how loud a debate it was occurring in biological sciences, which is in some sense the empirical sciences, or if you put it in sort of Aristotelian terms, the near efficient cause is an insufficient method or mode for approaching complex systems like ecosystems and that sort of thing. And there's even a molecular biologist in Canada, Robert Rosen, who's wanted to introduce the full Aristotelian four causes to account for things like ecosystems and the symbiotic relationship between species and all that kind of stuff. And of course the biological community wants nothing to do with anything that's going to have a final cause, because that brings up telos and all kinds of problems with that. But there's something about the empirical workspace, which being epistemically open, indeterminate in some sense, is a way of bringing some kind of a synthesizing device into a scientific methodology that doesn't carry with it all of the baggage of a final cause, which I think is extremely compelling. I think it's very compelling with respect to perception, but it might also be compelling in terms of scientific accounts of things. That the standard efficient cause or Newtonian paradigm sort of approach to science is limited, so this might actually have applications beyond just perception. But in other areas too, I think it's extremely compelling.
Well, thank you. That's a cool suggestion. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I think one of the reasons I was inspired by the work of Merleau-Ponty is precisely because he didn't just philosophize sort of in the abstract from the philosopher's armchair, but because he takes very seriously the work that psychologists and empirical scientists were doing in his day. But so in other words, I believe that these are not fundamentally incompatible approaches. So in other words, I think that philosophy should be open, especially now as contemporary neuroscience is so amazing and can do such tremendous things. Philosophy should be open, especially for anyone who's interested in the phenomenon of consciousness, to the methodology and the results of the sciences. And so that could extend, I do believe that could extend outside of the study of human cognition to the study of environments, especially since what I'm saying about the experiential workspace is a little bit like saying that our experience takes place in its own sort of experiential niche, right? That it has kind of intrinsic norms, right? That are not exported from any other situation, right? They're unique to that setting. But at the same time, I am sort of trying to kind of sound a real warning bell and say that there is a problem in that that pertains specifically to human experiencers, and that is that we kind of make our own norms, right? And so that means that they, as I was saying, that they emerge in and through the activity that we're engaged in. And so the warning bell is that when we construct a scientific experiment that's designed to show something about what it's like to be human, right, we fail to recognize that the structure of the experiment itself is an experiential workspace.
Already embedded.
That sets up certain, as he, a quote from the quote at the beginning, sets up certain practical and utilitarian norms that may not be compatible with the behavior and the quality of the experience that we're interested in studying. So I don't know, like I kind of want to say, this kind of concern should at least be an obstacle at first to further research, rather than being a kind of, green light for.
Well, can I put it maybe this way, that
Yeah.
maybe the standard empirical scientific methodology is perhaps necessary for the purposes of science, but insufficient for offering the context in which that actually has meaning, which is the empirical workspace. But the problem is the empirical workspace is not determinate because of its
Experiential
epistemic
workspace?
Yeah, the experiential workspace
Yeah.
is not sufficiently determinate because it can be
That's right.
it can be affected by too many other things.
Yeah.
Right, which opens the door to a lack of accountability.
How do you study something
Right.
that is intrinsically indeterminate and transforms as soon as you approach it?
Scientists
That's
can
the
all speak
problem.
with each other because they all inhabit or
Because they share the
they're
same
embedded in
norms,
the
right?
same-
They look for determinate phenomena
Right.
that stay put, right, and that can be reliably produced in experiment after experiment. And that just may not be the character of human experience. We may not.
But their agreement is not so much in terms of scientific verification, but in terms of having embedded themselves in the same
That's right.
workspace.
That's right. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Thank you. Okay, David, and then Robert.
I wanted to ask, I think you might have said something that addresses this, but so this is maybe a point of clarification. But I think you said that an inactive perception and an experiential workspace, that the norms come out of that space, right? That they grow out of the activity that's unique to that space. And so I was sort of wondering about the role of habits. I remember an interview with the jazz pianist Bill Evans, and they asked Bill Evans, how do you improvise, like that? And I mean, it could be 2 a.m. and he could be half drunk, and you can put him in front of a piano, and he could improvise. And it wasn't just that he had an automatic ability to do this thing. He could tunnel right into the thing that he does when he's on stage, even at awkward or unusual moments, which says to me that he is able to enter an experiential workspace more or less at will, because some of the norms do pre-exist the experiential workspace, because there are habits that pre-exist the experiential workspace. So I would guess that it would, so I'm not sure, you might have said something about thematized sort of there are sort of grand themes that carry into every new workspace. It's not as if we're inventing the workspace, ex nihilo every time we go into it. So is it that there's a mixture of habits and old norms that help us go from workspace to interruption back to workspace, or are you suggesting that the norms are always created every time you enter a workspace? Because then we have to find out how Bill Evans does what he does.
Let me just ask you a quick question about your example. What in your example corresponds to the habits that pre-exist the experiential workspace? So, which habits are those in your example of the improv jazz?
Right.
musician?
It's not just the finger motions or the knowledge of harmony or the knowledge of the melody or anything like that. It's an ability of a performer who are always interrupted by things happening in a crowded jazz club, right? Things spilling or microphones feeding back or whatever. The habit has to do with being able to tunnel right back in to the inactive workspace and to go right back there regardless. Now, not all performers can do this, right? The more seasoned you are, the more you can sort of deal with a heckler or deal with a distraction. But the habit has to do with finding your way back in when you're jolted.
Someone who really knows their way around jazz, right, or improvisational jazz, right? So who doesn't get shaken by new stimuli, right? So
Right.
someone who can get right back into the emergent norms of an improvisational piece. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I mean, let's see, what can I say about that? So if you remember the list of 4 points, right? The first thing I wanted to say is that the very ability to experience a situation as having pathways built into it that tell you what to do, right? That say go this way, right? And this is what happens anytime, for example, you come home, right? Your house kind of automatically functions for you as a as a place of experiential pathways that you know how to turn the key without thinking in the lock. If you get up at night in the dark, you know your way around to the bathroom. It's like things are sort of where you expect them to be. The same thing is true when you drive your car, right? So that you sort of automatically, you and your body and the car are sort of soldered together in this nice relationship where you know where to move and where to pull push the buttons and pull the levers, so to speak. And you can see that your car is for you a kind of experiential workspace when you switch to someone else's car. What do you do in someone else's car? You reach for the stick, what do we call this thing? The gear shift. You reach for the gear shift where it is in your car. Right? So you might be in this new vehicle, but you're actually still soldered to your old experiential workspace, right? So that's the sort of basic paradigm. But so one of the things I want to say is that those things are made possible through the acquisition of skillful repertoires that we carry with us, right? So that means if you're not a driver, right, that workspace doesn't exist for you. And that's really true if you've got any friends who have never driven, right? They have no access to your behavior behind the wheel. Right? They can't interpret it, sort of a mysterious kind of conjuring act for them. Okay, so the improvisational jazz musician carries with him or with her those skillful, intelligent repertoires, right? So what I would say about that is that like someone like that has spent so much time in the workspace of improvising that they carried around with them. They're like an expert driver, right? Like they're like someone who doesn't need any warm-up time before in order to know how to avoid a dangerous obstacle on a complex racetrack or something like that. They carry it with them all the time. So it's not that experiential workspaces crop up from scratch all over the place. It's that that the norms that govern our behavior within them are not norms that are given from the outside, so to speak. So what would that mean? Well, they're not norms that are sort of pre-written into our brains, right? They're not a priori norms that are structured into the nature of our consciousness. They also are not norms that come from that come through the sort of causal transmission of stimuli, right? So you can't get access to these norms by giving a causal account of how the visual stimuli for the jazz musician and the oral stimuli interact causally with the neurons in his or her brain, right? That would mean the norms are out in the physical universe, right? And they pre-exist determinately in that sense. But you also can't get them from going inside the structure of human consciousness and saying it's a priori wired so as to be able to deliver perfect improvisational jazz. Right, so I'm saying they're enacted in and through the relationship that a person establishes with a musical instrument, right? With the sort of
Keyboard itself.
the contingencies of the physical thing that you're playing, and the contingencies of jazz and the jazz standards, right? Which kind of set up a situation in which certain moves are permissible and others are not.
So okay, so it just
I wanted to clarify the sense in which
right.
something is there before, but it's not a kind of predetermined script either at the level of physical causality or at the level of a priori hardwiring or something like that.
Right. Now I wouldn't want to go that route. I don't know how you'd prove it anyway, but if I'm understanding what you're saying, the phrase skillful repertoire is a general way of pointing to norms that pre-exist the inactive workspace. And they're not brought in from outside in any radical sense, but they're brought with the person back into that workspace.
I wouldn't want to say that because of point 2, right? So I can go back to it.
Okay, so you see my question is why doesn't what does your phrase skillful repertoire mean, and why isn't it just directly in conflict with claim 1? Because if it's habits and norms, then they pre-exist. They don't come from an a priori place, but they come from some previous experience you had, and now I don't want to say they're encoded.
Now I think I see your question.
Okay.
Okay, so the language that I'm using here is being influenced by the fact that I'm teaching some students in philosophy of mind, Ryle. And so I'm using Rylean language, but it corresponds to this sentence, right? So we only have access to these things if we already are meaningfully engaged in that kind of behavior or that kind of activity, right? So you already have to be someone who understands how this project is structured if you're going to be able to step in and fill in for that person while they're gone. But the norms are not the skillful repertoires, right? So what I'm saying is that the norms are enacted in and through the skillful habits that someone brings and the contingencies of the setting, right? So I don't think that the norms reside in the habits. Otherwise, we would just get blind repetitions of the content of someone's habitual repertoire of behavior. Whereas I want to say point 2, right? The very nature of workspaces is that they transform. Right? So here we can use a distinction, more philosophy of mind, Ryle stuff coming, that Ryle makes between intelligent capacities and habits. The notion of habit is a little bit problematic in Merleau-Ponty and also in kind of stuff that you like and study, in that it suggests a kind of blind routine that is just kind of sort of programmed, that we've learned it, we've drilled it into ourselves, and we just do it the same way over and over again. Whereas the kind of behavior I'm talking about is behavior that is kind of intrinsically open to learning, intrinsically open to kind of transforming itself in the process of trying to cope with the demands of a workspace or a setting. So anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is I would sort of challenge the identification of the normativity of our behavior with the habits or skillful repertoires that we bring in there. And I would want to say, let's use a term that doesn't portray these skillful repertoires as just sort of kind of blind, sort of mindless, repetitive acts.
Right.
Okay, Rob, sorry.
Well, actually, Myra and I were talking about a similar connected phenomenon the other day, which is the difficulty of going in and lecturing to someone else's class.
Yeah, that's right. It's a perfect example of the same problem.
And you would think, or you might think going into it, that, well, it's the same sort of setting that you have in your own classes, and you have a blackboard, you have the equipment there, or you can give a PowerPoint presentation, that sort of thing. what's complicated about it is that what it shows you is that teaching relies upon a certain kind of rapport and a pre-understanding about various concepts and so on that can be communicated in subtle ways between teacher and student, so that the student isn't getting it, they're totally at a loss, or they are understanding. It's hard to it's hard for there to be that body language communication or whatever if you go into someone else's class. Anyway, so that's an interesting example to use in terms of this phenomenon. The other thing, though, in terms of the issue of empirical research, it seems to me it's a really fascinating perspective to take on the debate over the Milgram experiments, because those experiments, what was so controversial about them beyond the ethical...
Will you say a little bit about what the experiment was,
so,
just for people who don't?
Most people are familiar with these experiments carried out in the early 60s, where Stanley Milgram at Yale would have people come in and they were asked to administer electric shocks to someone, and there are different details about how the experiment was structured, but basically what he was trying to figure out is how obedient the subjects would be to the demand that they administer the shock simply because they had agreed to take part in the experiment. So it's like the classic example people bring up in terms of research ethics, because it seems unethical to put people in that situation. But more interestingly, from this point of view, the problem with the way the experiment is set up is that it's not clear that you can really empirically test obedience within an experiment in which people are in this trusting relationship to an institution, Yale University, and a particular representative of the university, and they are asked to do these things that upon reflection they would say, well, why was I administering electric shocks? And so what's jarring about the research setup, it has to do with something like what you're describing, the experiential workspace, and anyway.
That's a fine example to illustrate the exact problem that I'm trying to point to. Because what the experiment does is it puts equal signs between all kinds of things that might not be equivalent, right? So it says, okay, the behavior of someone in the lab pressing a lever who's been told all kinds of things is equal to the behavior of someone out in the world, right? Like a jail keeper or someone who's overseeing, sort of illegal immigrant employees at Walmart or something like that, right? So maybe not, right? Like, so the point is, like, there's a fascinating complexity to the way someone experiences themselves in a social setting such as a laboratory, where there's a white-coated person who says, do this, we're running an experiment, right? They've been told that an experiment is being conducted. So that's part of the place that they take themselves to be living in. And so to say that that setting and their behavior in that setting is going to be automatically predictive of their behavior in other contexts, it's like so many moves are being made, right? Yeah. We'd have to see, are these things really comparable worlds, or do people experience themselves in quite the same way? Yeah.
I'm also struck by the example of storytelling. That, if you're watching a movie or if you're watching a TV show or you're listening to a story, that one of the difficult things to get the audience to do, or as an audience member to do, is to suspend disbelief, which means that you're having difficulty getting your experiential workspace to jive with whatever the experiential workspace that you're being invited into. But if you start a story with once upon a time, and it's ended with, and they all lived happily ever after, within that context you're going to be perfectly happy that fairies come in and the witches come in, and that magical powers are going to be found and all that kind of stuff. But that you're essentially establishing a particular workspace, and the suspension of disbelief of the audience is already overcome. You've overcome the hurdle of suspending disbelief with that type of rote thing, like in playing music, if you're playing the head, the jazz musicians all know what that is. They all come together. They all know what they're now playing. They have rhythm. They have beat. They have chord signatures and whatnot, which are all fixed, but they're not absolutely determined as what the story's going to be. told.
Mhm.
And the story can have all kinds of variations between once upon a time and they all lived happily ever after.
Yeah, yeah. I would say there that that's an example that shows that there's a way that experiential workspaces can be these very general things that we are embedded in a very powerful way ongoingly, right? They're not just sort of local things that are enacted here and now and then melt away, right? So I think that what a good storyteller does, a good cinematographer does, is that they show a good phenomenological understanding of the experiential workspace that you could say, that you could call growing old, right? Like in a movie about aging, or the experiential workspace of tragedy, right? Someone who knows their way around how things appear in that workspace and can tell that story, right?
Otherwise, it's not believable, and people will
That's
critique
right,
the movie, but it's not
and a
believable.
bad storyteller is someone who's someone like a not very good improvisational musician, someone who's not attuned to the real intrinsic demands of that world.
I remember when Disney did the Pocahontas cartoon, and people were critical of the that it's not real, it's not giving a real picture of it, and then somebody says, "There's a singing raccoon, for heaven's sake." No, it's not real. It's a cartoon. People were yeah.
But everyone brings their own experience to it too, to the story. I mean, so this, I guess I was most impressed with you were talking about relationships and how they impact workspaces. I mean, like the example of teaching someone else's class, I have the same experience when I teach the same class too. I teach an 8 o'clock class and a 10 o'clock class of exactly the same material.
Feels so different.
It does very different things occur, even though my lecture notes, my blackboard, I'm in the same room, but the students just do differently. I mean, so it's the relationship that brings the variability to the workspace.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Gee, that's such an interesting. Those two questions are hard for me to answer from the standpoint of what I've said here. So, I guess my paper was an effort to try to show that our relationships alter the way we see. Right? They alter the way we hear. The look of things is different depending on my sense of whether those threatening boys are on the field with me, right, or whether I'm with my female friends. Like that's a personal example, right? Like I found certain kinds of sports quite scary, but they were less scary when I was on my own or just with friends. So what I want to say is that someone, in this response to film, someone could understand that, right, and use that awareness in order to tell a better story. And using that ability, right, using the insight into the way in which interpersonal experience affects the way we see things, could enable that person to tell a story that is more universal, right, that would allow more people into it. So that it wouldn't really be true to say each person sees the movie in his or her own unique way, because the movie maker is actually understanding this larger experiential setting in which many of us have our being, right? Like so there are commonalities. Right?
It would be more nearly universal.
Yeah,
It would
that's
still
right.
be somebody.
Absolutely.
Brought.
Yeah, no, and that's why a lot of times you have an excellent movie and someone doesn't get it, right? Because their life is too constrained or too darkened by whatever troubles there. It's an excellent movie and they still just didn't get it. Didn't
They
like
can't
it.
get embedded.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess I'm wondering to what extent there's a relationship. I keep thinking about Pierre Bourdieu's idea about the habitus and habitus, that, there are these habituses we inhabit, that we live within, and we understand and we negotiate our relationships within us, because there's this kind of koine or common understanding about our relationship. But it likewise within that there's flexibility of change, but there are also they're exclusive in a kind of way, because there are people who come into those habituses who aren't familiar with the language or the dynamics of that particular social set or group, and have to kind of learn to interact. And I'm wondering if there's a relationship between your model and that larger sort of social model.
Yeah. I think many people have seen a lot of contact between Bourdieu and Merleau-Ponty, but it's not something I've studied, so I can't be sure. But it sounds like the same kind of thing. Yeah, Myra.
I was thinking of all three of these comments, thinking about in cognitive psychology this concept of a script or a frame, which is like the story, once upon a time. You say once upon a time, I've got the picture, or what, you know, so there's it for the classroom, you know, I have a script for my classroom. I go in, I put my stuff down, I write some stuff on the board. But there is always fine tuning within a script or a frame, so they both operate, which I think is compatible with what you're saying. If there is, it's not sufficient to say habit, script, frame, and call it a day. You say, yes, that helps us a lot, that automaticity of driving a car, teaching, doing a lecture, or whatever it is. But there's always that concept of fine tuning within that frame. And so even if you take any of the work that Minsky frames of mind, or, his wasn't frame, but these are what talks about the cognitive frames, or scripts is another word. So they're there, they're very helpful, and that's what you're calling the workspace, but there's still this attunement within, it never just a blind. So I think that speaks to this problem of not being, you know, or the habitus, you know, like there's always a fine tuning within the script. The script is a very helpful way in which we enter in. So I think it's, you know, even these examples are excellent to make this, to corroborate the point, you know.
Hope this makes sense. It seems that any change is subject to a new influence's effect on the existing maintenance of the embedded behaviors as defined by a social norm. That's what I got out of it. And if this is so, and the new influence of change could be possibly the beginnings of a new social norm for this embedded behavior, the influence that is occurring. I mean, it comes in, even though it's slight, over a period of time, it can expand, and the expansion and contraction goes back and forth until finally a new social norm is formed out of just the new influence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me, give me 1 second just to process and think it right. I can answer that.
I'm thinking of an instance of, say, like a new person coming into a workplace with a varied behavior from the existing social norm that exists there, just slightly enough so that eventually it's accepted and that behavior becomes accepted. Then possibly another person shows up, another person, and the domino.
Could eventually create a set entirely
Yes,
different from
yes,
the original one.
Exactly, and I mean, the mindset changes, saves the good maybe from the old one, and processes that as a new.
I mean,
new
like
part
when I
of the
moved
new-
to Denver, I thought you slowed down for yellow lights. When I lived in Denver, I now know you speed up at yellow lights.
Yeah.
Where are the
Depends
country
on how
people
yellow
slow
you
down for
are.
yellow
Yeah,
lights?
that's right. Yeah, so I think the initial difficulty I was having is just that you're using the term social norm in a way that's slightly different from the way I would want to use the concept of norms here. But the point you're making is one that I definitely agree with, right? So it's like, you know, if someone comes and takes over your work project, right? What I was saying is they can only really do that if they're already livingly embedded in that same kind of work project to begin with. Otherwise, they come in there and things get messed up, right? Like so, let's take the example of a teacher, right? So the best person, the person you want to teach your class is someone who you know has been teaching the same material, right? Or who is some way closer to the thing you were doing. On the other hand, though, someone can come and teach your class and discover resources in that workspace that you didn't know existed, right? That's I think that this kind of example that you have in mind, right? And that sort of speaks to point 2. I was trying to say that these settings in which we have our being are not fixed, right? They're not the product of blind repetition, and they don't retain a static form. Right, they're inherently open to transformation. That means that if someone can gear in partially, right, but only partially, the very things that they do that don't fit can be kind of transformative for other people, right? So that way of doing things.
So maintenance is a big issue then in saving the space, so to speak.
Maintenance?
The status quo, saving maintenance
Help
of
us face.
repetition
Yeah.
of that without new idea, it just maintains.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a workspace that corresponds to monotony, right, and coercion, right? So I think what you see sometimes in, you know, in kind of administrative or bureaucratic institutional settings is that the experiential workspace that is being generated by the project is being shut down by external norms that are imposed by, you know, the rules of how we do this, right? So, and that mode of behavior, right, the mode of administrative or institutional coercion, let's say, to put it strongly, is its own kind of behavior, right? So you can see situations in which there's a clash between behavioral settings or experiential workspaces, where you can try to import alien norms, right, and you end up kind of damaging the thing that was happening.
Right.
Yeah.
That's just to come back to that word habit. I think that the reason I chose the example of the jazz improviser is that part of their habit is an openness to not running the script as it was before. So, for example, you gave the example of someone who gets in a car and they immediately reach for the gear shift and it's not there or it's in the wrong place. The first thing I do when I get in someone else's car is I look around and see where stuff is. So my habit is to try to notice what's different before acting, and that's a habit which is kind of, it's a habit of, you know, it's a habit of openness in that I try to gauge the possibilities, and that's what Bill Evans does when he improvises. He doesn't come in and start running his improviser scripts or enacting his skillful repertoire. He comes into a situation and he immediately makes himself open. This is why artists are such sensitive types, because they have the habit of keeping themselves open, and that's why they can be hurt or they can take things so seriously sometimes. So it seems like there may be some habits which are just like the running of scripts, the same way they were before over and over again. And some habits are habits where you say, new situation, you know, look around.
Yeah.
Dave's got the habits of a car thief.
That's right. I didn't do it. I didn't do it,
In
Mark.
some ways, I think that is the ethical call that is embedded within phenomenology, is to become attentive to these very subtle, complex forms that are embedded in the way we experience. Right? They're not anything you can find in, you know, a neuroscience textbook. Right? You also can't find them in you know, a book of etiquette. Right? Like they're emergent norms, and becoming attuned to them, like, helps you live better, helps you understand other people better, helps you communicate better. So that's what you find if you study phenomenology, if you study especially Merleau-Ponty's sort of more ethically oriented works, is that kind of call to, you know, not just embeddedness within the, you know, the workspaces that you happen to have grown into, right? But a kind of willingness to look at workspaces themselves and move into them and see how they work and sort of take your cues from their complexity.
I think the word workspace in a way might need a little more clarification for audiences, because I know there's not a mind-body split operating here, but when people hear workspace, they're going to think the openness comes from the physical place, or it comes from the objects in the space, and the word habit puts it on the agent instead of the scene.
That's right. I
But
don't want
but it's somewhere in between.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Good thing.
I was thinking of just one thing in reading your title here, the contraction of interpersonal workspace. As a positive norm is existing, how can it be influenced then to contract? So that's actually possibly through an external negativity or something that occurs to it, stress or something. I was thinking that it's, well, like the debunking of a society, Roman Empire. It existed and so forth, and we know it fell and why and so forth. But compare that to, on a minor scale, on a workspace, where there have been episodes of a perfectly functioning unit falling apart for some reasons, it could, whatever. But there must be a plausible explanation for that. I mean, a unity explanation rather than just interpersonal relationships.
Well, your own example, if you bring in a foreign element that sufficiently disrupts the workspace,
It could.
literally.
It could.
Yeah,
Yes,
it disrupts the
disrupt it
workspace.
totally, yeah, right. Good point.
Well, good. I think we're at our point, right?
Yeah, let's join in thanking Maria for this fine
Thank you.
presentation.
So it's not a yellow light, it's a zone of proximal development. I like that.
There are still a bunch of cookies left in the break room if someone wants to enact some cookie eating workspace experiences.